In the immediate aftermath of World War II, Europe found itself fractured, economically strained, and burdened by a seemingly insurmountable number of abandoned military assets. Among the most visible remnants of the conflict were the thousands of military trucks scattered across the continent in fields, forests, abandoned bases, and depots. These vehicles, once integral to the war effort, had outlived their purpose, but their fate was far from settled. The sheer scale of this surplus posed logistical and economic challenges that would take years to resolve. By the end of the war in 1945, the United States, the Soviet Union, and the United Kingdom, along with their respective allies, had flooded Europe with military vehicles to support the war effort. The American fleet of military trucks alone was vast. Estimates suggest that by 1944, over 700,000 trucks had been produced for the Allied forces. Many of these vehicles were designed for a specific purpose in the unique conditions of warfare. However, with the war's end, the need for such an immense fleet quickly dissipated. Large sections of the infrastructure that had supported the Allied military operations were dismantled or repurposed for peacetime use. The trucks were no longer needed, but the question of what to do with them would take years to resolve. The war's end saw Europe plunged into an era of reconstruction, and the immediate economic realities made the disposal of such a vast quantity of military equipment a logistical nightmare. The Allied powers, now allies in peace but facing a fractured continent, had different priorities. The US, for example, faced the challenge of withdrawing its forces from Europe, while the UK and France sought to rebuild their devastated economies and infrastructure. At the same time, the Soviet Union, with its own military ambitions, was entangled in both occupation and reparations. The immediate priority for all these nations was to focus on rebuilding critical infrastructure and stabilizing their economies. The surplus military trucks, many of which were in varying degrees of disrepair, did not fit neatly into this plan. The fate of these trucks was largely determined by a combination of immediate practical needs and long-term strategic decisions. For many of the vehicles, their value was primarily scrap metal. The raw materials that had gone into producing the trucks were still valuable in post-war Europe, where resources were limited. However, scrapping them was a complex process. It required significant labor, transportation, and industrial capacity, all of which were in short supply in the immediate post-war years. In addition, the cost of dismantling such large quantities of equipment had to be balanced against the value of the raw materials recovered. For many governments, the decision to scrap the vehicles was often made reluctantly, as the costs of such a process could outweigh the potential economic benefit. Despite these challenges, some trucks found new life in unexpected ways. The U.S. military, which had brought millions of vehicles into Europe, had already begun efforts to reclaim and repair military trucks. In some cases, these vehicles were stripped of their military insignia and repurposed for civilian use. Governments in war-torn European countries began to repurpose vehicles for reconstruction efforts. They were used to transport goods and materials in the rebuilding of critical infrastructure. These trucks, many of which were still in working condition, offered a temporary solution to the transportation crises in the aftermath of the war. Yet, this was far from a universal solution. The trucks that were still serviceable were often too specialized for everyday civilian use, leaving many unsuitable for long-term employment in peacetime economies. Even in cases where vehicles were put to use, the lack of spare parts and the decline in manufacturing capacity meant that they could not be maintained for long. In the years following the war, some of the military trucks that had been refurbished began to break down, and with the end of wartime production, replacements were hard to come by. As early as 1946, reports of trucks being abandoned in remote areas began to appear. These vehicles were often left in place when they could no longer be repaired or when there was simply no longer a need for them. In addition to being abandoned in rural areas, many of the trucks were also left at former military installations. The extensive network of airfields, depots, and warehouses that had supported the war effort now stood empty, their contents largely discarded. The presence of these trucks at former military bases painted a stark picture of a continent in the process of shifting from war to peace. In some cases, the trucks were left in situ, where they became rusted, stripped, and slowly consumed by the elements. Abandoned vehicles, often with their tires deflated and their bodies pockmarked by bullet holes, became a common sight throughout Europe in the years following the war. This widespread abandonment was not entirely an oversight. In the immediate post-war years, the sheer volume of surplus military equipment, trucks, jeeps, tanks, and other vehicles, made it difficult for governments to coordinate the disposal process. As Europe was rebuilding, the last thing most countries could afford was an effort to systematically address the surplus military vehicles scattered across their landscapes. The primary focus was on feeding populations, providing shelter, and restoring basic services. Military trucks, once symbols of strategic power, were now largely seen as waste products, their original purpose forgotten in the midst of more pressing concerns. Even when disposal efforts were made, there were instances of inefficiency. Some trucks, particularly those that had been left in remote or difficult-to-reach locations, were never recovered. The cost of retrieving them was too high, and as the years passed, these vehicles became part of the landscape of post-war Europe, slowly decaying but remaining a testament to the scale of the war effort. In the early years of the Cold War, some military trucks were taken by the occupying forces of the Soviet Union and repurposed for their own use. The Soviets, who had their own surplus of military vehicles, found a need for a large number of these trucks in their occupation zones, where they were used to support industrial projects or bolster the logistical capacity of their forces. While many of these trucks were sent to the Soviet Union for scrap or further repurposing, some were kept in service in Eastern Europe for years after the war, adding another layer to the complex fate of these vehicles. For the Western powers, the focus shifted toward dismantling and scrapping the trucks that had become obsolete. However, by 1947, as the United States shifted its focus from post-war occupation to the emerging global Cold War, large-scale disposal operations began to lose urgency. Instead, smaller-scale efforts were undertaken to offload surplus trucks through a combination of sales and donations to European countries. Yet, many of these trucks were soon found to be impractical for peacetime use. With limited civilian infrastructure and the decline of wartime production, the market for such specialized vehicles began to fade. In countries like France and Germany, some military trucks were sold to civilian contractors, but the reality of their limited lifespan meant they too would eventually face the scrapyard. Despite efforts to recycle and repurpose, the scale of the truck surplus was so immense that much of it remained abandoned or dismantled over the course of the next decade. These trucks, once crucial tools in the effort to win the war, became symbols of the post-war chaos, their fates lingering in uncertainty as Europe moved into the 1950s. Its economies slowly recovering but still deeply scarred by the devastation of war. The abandonment of these trucks was not an isolated incident but part of a broader, continent-wide process of reckoning with the legacies of the war. For the governments of Europe, the economic and logistical challenges of dealing with the war's aftermath, its surplus military vehicles, damaged infrastructure, and collapsed industries, would continue to unfold for years. The trucks, like many other remnants of the war, served as stark reminders of the scale of the conflict, now left to rust and rot in fields across the continent, their once proud status as symbols of military might now reduced to rusting husks. By the late 1940s, the fate of abandoned military trucks in Europe had become a complex interplay of economics, bureaucratic inertia, and emerging industrial priorities. In Western Europe, particularly in France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, the initial post-war relief efforts had largely consumed the labor and materials needed to repair infrastructure and provide for displaced populations. Military trucks, often left in vast numbers along rural roads or in decimated industrial zones, remained a secondary concern. In France, records indicate that approximately 50,000 U.S. manufactured trucks had been left scattered across depots and rural areas by 1946. Local authorities were reluctant to engage with them due to the costs associated with retrieval and repair. Many vehicles were stripped by scavengers seeking tires, engines, or metal fittings, leaving skeletons that gradually deteriorated under the elements. In Germany, the scale of abandonment was staggering. Allied occupation forces had left behind hundreds of thousands of vehicles, including trucks from both the German Wehrmacht and the U.S. and British armies. The British zone alone accounted for over 100,000 trucks, many concentrated in depots around Hamburg, Hanover, and Bremen. The Allied Control Council faced a dilemma. Storing them in depots consumed valuable land and resources, but scrapping them en masse presented logistical and economic challenges. Initial policies leaned toward systematic dismantling. However, the shortage of industrial labor meant that large-scale scrapping was delayed. By 1948, aerial surveys revealed that hundreds of depots across northern Germany contained rotting vehicles, their frames corroding and paint flaking in the damp northern climate. In Italy, the situation mirrored that of Germany and France, though on a slightly smaller scale. Allied forces had deposited an estimated 20,000 trucks in northern industrial centers such as Turin and Milan. Initially, some were requisitioned for municipal reconstruction projects or road-building programs. Italian industry, weakened by years of wartime destruction, was eager to repurpose available mechanical components. However, the aging and sometimes highly specialized design of the trucks, which had been tailored for wartime logistics rather than civilian use, limited their utility. Many vehicles were abandoned in former military camps or along major highways, where they served as informal markers of roadworks or military boundaries. As the Italian government stabilized and began large-scale reconstruction programs, the attention of industrial planners shifted toward newer, civilian-grade vehicles, leaving the abandoned trucks largely forgotten. The Soviet occupation zones in eastern Germany and Poland introduced a different dynamic. Here, large numbers of trucks were commandeered, either for direct use in reconstruction projects or for transportation of reparations and raw materials to the Soviet Union. Some vehicles, particularly those in serviceable condition, were maintained in centralized depots, while less practical units were sent to improvised scrap yards. Estimates suggest that between 1945 and 1949, over 150,000 trucks were either exported to the USSR or dismantled on site for metal recovery. This massive extraction effort placed significant strain on local labor and transportation networks, but was considered a necessary measure for economic and strategic purposes. For communities in these regions, the removal of vehicles was both a relief and a loss. It cleared space but also deprived them of potential temporary transport solutions. Smaller nations faced their own sets of problems. In Belgium, roughly 10,000 trucks were abandoned or impounded by municipal authorities. Many had been left near rail depots or along highways leading to industrial centers. The Belgian government, operating under severe post-war budgetary constraints, prioritized feeding its population and rebuilding factories, leaving abandoned military trucks in a state of indefinite limbo. Some municipalities attempted piecemeal sales or local recycling, but the lack of coordinated national policy limited effectiveness. Similar patterns were observed in the Netherlands, where trucks abandoned in rural provinces were often left to decay until local scrap dealers organized collection operations in the early 1950s. One recurring theme across all European nations was the intersection of environmental exposure and material degradation. Military trucks, initially designed for operational resilience, were not intended for long-term storage in unprotected environments. Rust, water damage, and mechanical failure quickly rendered large percentages inoperable. Tire rubber, exposed to sun and temperature fluctuations, deteriorated rapidly. Engines seized due to corrosion, and fuel tanks became repositories for water and debris. By 1947, surveys conducted in Germany, France, and Italy indicated that up to 40% of abandoned trucks were effectively beyond repair without extensive refurbishment. This contributed to the growing perception that large-scale scrapping or abandonment was inevitable. Another factor shaping the post-war fate of these trucks was the global economic context. In the late 1940s, Europe was entering the early stages of recovery, but industrial capacity remained constrained, and labor shortages were widespread. The Marshall Plan, initiated in 1948, would soon inject significant resources into reconstruction, but until its full effect took hold, nations relied on local solutions. Trucks that could be salvaged provided immediate, short-term benefits for construction and transportation, but vehicles in poor condition represented liabilities. Scrapping operations required fuel, manpower, and industrial machinery, all in limited supply. As a result, Abandoned trucks accumulated in depots, fields, and warehouses across the continent, creating a patchwork of decay visible even from aerial reconnaissance. In addition to economic and logistical pressures, bureaucratic factors delayed the disposition of trucks. Responsibility for abandoned military assets was often divided among multiple agencies, military, civil, and occupation authorities, leading to inconsistent policies. In France, for example, trucks in certain depots were classified as military surplus for disposal, while others remained under regional administrative control, leading to delays in collection or scrapping. Germany, fragmented into zones of occupation, faced similar complications. American, British, French, and Soviet authorities frequently disagreed on prioritization, resulting in trucks remaining in storage for years. This bureaucratic inertia ensured that vehicles which might otherwise have been repurposed or sold remained idle, contributing further to visual and material decay. Urban areas experienced a different pattern of abandonment. In major cities like Berlin, Hamburg, Paris, and Milan, many trucks were left in city outskirts, near ports, or alongside major roads. In some instances, these vehicles were seized informally by local populations, stripped for metal or fuel, and integrated into informal economies. This process was largely unregulated, resulting in a mix of salvaged components and complete vehicles in derelict condition. By the early 1950s, even trucks that had been initially repurposed for municipal tasks were gradually retired due to maintenance difficulties, marking a slow but steady transition towards systematic dismantling or permanent abandonment. Rail transport played a significant role in the post-war disposition of trucks. Where feasible, abandoned vehicles were loaded onto freight trains and shipped to centralized scrap yards or storage facilities. In France and Germany, specialized depots near rail networks were established to consolidate surplus vehicles. This process was labor-intensive, requiring cranes, flat cars, and coordinated scheduling. It also incurred substantial cost, which often exceeded the value of the recovered metal. Nevertheless, centralized transport allowed governments to prioritize certain vehicles for repair, repurposing, or export while leaving irrecoverable units behind in rural or inaccessible areas. Even with these measures, thousands of trucks remained scattered across the countryside, gradually succumbing to weathering and neglect.